Hi, guys, and welcome to another 7-minute lecture. The tragedy of Charles Darwin's life, or I guess the tragedies in Charles Darwin's life. That's what I want to look at today because I've always found it very interesting. His work has been so influential on every field of knowledge, and yet sometimes we tend to look at these things like they exist in a vacuum, right? Instead of examining the personal or cultural context in which some of these great thinkers came to those conclusions. Charles Darwin, as we all know, is best known for putting forward the theory of evolution. And even though the modern scientific understanding of evolution is far more sophisticated and complex than what Darwin himself suggested, and even though other civilizations like the ancient Greeks and the ancient Hindus did have their own ideas about evolution, despite all that, he is still remembered and credited as having given birth to that way of thinking. Firstly, I don't mean to suggest from the title that his entire life was a tragedy. That wouldn't be accurate at all. But it's also undeniable that people who write about Darwin's life also point out to the melancholic nature of it and some of the sad events that transpired in the course of his days. The most famous one is, of course, the loss of his children, particularly the death of his daughter Anne, who died at the age of 10, which was a major event in his life. Historians think it was tuberculosis that killed her, but there's no way for us to know all of that for sure. Darwin even wrote, "The joy of the household is gone," and he mourned her death until the very end of his own life. So I'd say that was the first major tragedy in adult Darwin's life. He did seem to derive strength from this, though, because while a lot of people may and do turn towards religion for solace and comfort during those times, Darwin seems to have gone in the opposite direction. He started immersing himself in scientific inquiry even more. And it was only after his daughter's death, about 8 years later, that he wrote and published his most groundbreaking work, The Origin of Species. And when we read the original text again, knowing this tidbit about Darwin's life makes the reading experience even more powerful because there's so much there about the circle of life, there's so much there about death, and Darwin clearly seems to be convinced that all this evil and death and horror that we see in nature is not the design of some deliberate hand, but rather a part of the way that nature itself functions. So, for example, he talks about the way in which these wasps that he observes hatch their babies by depositing the eggs inside a caterpillar, and the babies then eat the caterpillar from the inside out until they grow big enough to explore the outside world. It's like a horror movie. And what makes it even more terrifying is that the caterpillar is kept alive for the entire process, even as the wasp hatchlings eat all its internal organs from the inside. It's just paralyzed and unable to move for days as they eat it slowly. But he doesn't get philosophical about it. He simply explains that cruelty as just being a part of the natural world as it is. It's a completely natural act. So I would say the loss of his daughter made him contemplate death a lot, which eventually you could suggest drove him towards his overall big picture outlook on evolution. The second big tragedy was the loss of yet another child, his 18-month-old son. So after completing the work, he was just about to publish his findings to the Linnean Society, which was Britain's leading natural history institution. And he had been working on this book for like 20 years. He had made the voyage on the Beagle 20 years ago. It was supposed to be his big moment of glory. But just 2 days before that, his son died. And Darwin was so heartbroken that he never made the presentation. He stayed to attend his son's funeral, and the book nonetheless was a big hit, and his theory of revolution totally revamped the conversation about nature and God in Western civilization. But he never really recovered from the loss of his children. Additionally, he wasn't someone who wanted to come in with his work and shatter people's faith in God either. And here's the third tragedy. Darwin knew that what he was writing was blasphemous, and he knew that people were going to be offended. He even said writing the book almost felt like confessing to a murder. He didn't want to offend anybody, and yet he unfortunately ended up offending almost everybody. He was subjected to widespread ridicule and mockery when the book came out. People were like, how dare you suggest we descended from monkeys? There were satirical cartoons and insults that were published about him in popular newspapers. He was turned into a public joke for making what would eventually become one of the most important facets of human knowledge. This leads us to the next tragedy in his life, which was the way Darwin reacted to all of this criticism. He became even more reserved and shut in. He never really fought back and confronted the people insulting him. He wasn't that kind of a person. So he just took all the insults and mockery, and he suffered more or less in total silence. In later editions of the book, he even tried to diffuse some of this tension by saying, look, evolution is a part of God's design, blah, blah, blah. But the damage had already been done, and he was helpless about it. The people who hated him continued to hate him. So even though the modern world might celebrate him as being the person who dismantled the Christian outlook on the nature and history of life, that reputation was always something which hurt him a great deal personally. And Darwin's final tragedy was his death itself. The man was rock climbing, yes, rock climbing at the age of 73, which is amazing. He contracted some unknown disease. There are theories about what it was, but we can never be sure. And in just a couple of months, this fit 73-year-old man who could even go rock climbing got sicker and sicker and died. That itself isn't the tragedy either. There's more. He wanted to be buried in the local cemetery with his children. But by then, he had become such an important figure, and his work had become so influential that his body was buried at Westminster Abbey instead, because apparently that was where all the famous people were buried. So even in death, the poor guy couldn't catch a break. He couldn't be buried with his children like he wanted. And those were some of the major tragedies in the life and death of Charles Darwin. If you like content like this, please don't forget to share and subscribe. Thank you, take care, and I'll see you soon.